laced confines of a requisitioned chateau in Zonhoven, Belgium. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the sharp-eyed British commander with his signature beret tilted just so, paced the creaking wooden floors, his polished boots echoing like distant artillery, as he rehearsed the words that could either unify or shatter the fragile Allied front. His aides, huddled around a map-strewn table under the flicker of oil lamps, watched him intently, sensing the weight of the moment. For Montgomery, ever the tactician with a flair for drama, was about to address the press amid the chaos of the Ardennes Offensive, a desperate German counterattack that had pierced the American lines like a dagger through snow, threatening to unravel months of hard-won gains across Western Europe. As he straightened his uniform, adjusting the medals that gleamed like accusations, Montgomery's mind raced back to the brutal winter battles where American soldiers, caught off guard in the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, had bled and frozen in foxholes, holding the line against Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, which by then had claimed tens of thousands of lives, turned picturesque villages into rubble-strewn graveyards, and exposed the raw nerves of an alliance forged in fire but tested by egos and national pride. The global context loomed larger than the Ardennes mists, with the world hanging in precarious balance, as Soviet forces hammered at Germany's eastern flanks from the Vistula River, pushing toward Berlin in a tide of vengeance, while in the Pacific, American Marines Island hopped through blood-soaked atolls, inching closer to Japan's heart. Yet here in Europe, the Western Allies, Britain, the United States, Canada, and others, faced not just the Wehrmacht's fury but the internal fractures that could doom them all. For if the command structure cracked under the strain of rivalry, the war's end might stretch into unimaginable horrors, prolonging the Holocaust's machinery, the death camp's smoke, and the civilian agony from London to Leningrad. Montgomery, a hero of El Alamein and Normandy, believed he alone had salvaged the disaster, having been granted temporary command over American armies by Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower on 20 December 1944, a decision born of desperation as German panzers roared through the fog-shrouded hills, isolating units like the 101st Airborne in Bastogne, where paratroopers, low on ammunition and wrapped in scavenged blankets, whispered prayers against the encircling enemy, their defiance epitomized by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's terse reply to surrender demands: nuts. Yet as Montgomery lit a cigarette, exhaling smoke that curled like battlefield haze, he couldn't shake the undercurrents of resentment. For the Americans, led by generals like Omar Bradley and George Patton, chafed at British oversight, viewing it as an insult to their valor, especially after the initial intelligence failures that had allowed Hitler's surprise assault to bulldoze through weakly held sectors, capturing supply depots and sowing panic in rear echelons, where clerks and cooks grabbed rifles to stem the tide. In this charged atmosphere, Montgomery's press conference, scheduled for that afternoon, in a makeshift briefing room filled with war correspondents from London dailies and New York wires, carried emotional stakes as high as the snowdrifts outside, for his words could heal the rift or ignite a transatlantic firestorm, pitting Churchill's imperial resolve against Roosevelt's democratic might, at a time when unity was the only bulwark against Nazi resurgence, and the human cost already staggering with over 80,000 American casualties in the Bulge alone, bodies stiffening in the cold. Families back home receiving dreaded telegrams demanded leaders who prioritized victory over vanity. As the Marshal stepped toward the podium, his face set in that familiar mix of confidence and condescension, the world held its breath, unaware that this single event might push the Allied command to the brink of collapse, testing friendships forged in invasion beaches and threatening to rewrite the war's final chapters in discord rather than triumph. The briefing room in Zonhoven smelled of wet wool, cigarette smoke, and stale coffee as Montgomery stepped to the makeshift podium on that cold 7th January 1945 afternoon, flashbulbs popping. like distant flak bursts, while a packed semicircle of British and American correspondents leaned forward, notebooks poised, sensing blood in the air. The field marshal's voice, crisp and clipped with that unmistakable upper-class drawl, cut through the murmurs as he began calmly, praising the courage of the Allied soldier, acknowledging the ferocity of the German assault that had begun on 16th December 1944, and then almost casually, crediting his own planning and leadership for having tidied up the front and restored the situation north of the Bulge. To the British reporters, accustomed to Montgomery's self-assurance, the words sounded like vintage Monty, the victor of Alamein speaking plain truth. But to the Americans in the room, men who had covered the GI's desperate stand at St. Vith, the frozen hell of Elsenborn Ridge, and Patton's lightning relief of Bastogne on 26 December 1944, the implication landed like a slap that their armies had been rescued by a British general who had only taken command after the damage was done. Montgomery pressed on, describing how he had gripped the two American armies, the 1st and the 9th, with firm hands, turning chaos into order. His tone paternal, almost schoolmasterly, as though explaining a rugby match gone wrong to slow learners. He spoke of the initial American dispositions as not good, of the enemy's penetration as a natural consequence, and of his own methodical counterstrokes as the decisive factor, never once mentioning Eisenhower's strategic oversight, Bradley's dogged coordination, or Patton's audacious 90-degree wheel through, blizzard and fuel shortages that had smashed into the German southern flank. The room grew quieter, the scratching of pencils louder, as the American correspondents exchanged glances, faces hardening with every carefully chosen phrase. Outside, snow continued to fall on the shattered pine forests where wrecked Shermans and Panthers still smoked, where medics carried frostbitten boys to aid stations, and where the ground was too frozen for proper graves. By the time Montgomery concluded with a confident nod and stepped back, the damage was already racing down the wires. Headlines forming in editors' minds across the Atlantic. Words that would soon ignite fury from SHAEF, headquarters in Paris, to the Pentagon corridors, threatening to fracture the coalition at its most vulnerable hour. By the morning of 8 January 1945, the first dispatches from Zonhoven had crossed the Atlantic, hitting newsrooms in New York and Washington like incoming shells. Headlines screamed variations of the same theme. Montgomery claims he saved Americans in Bulge. British general says U.S. troops needed rescuing. Monty takes credit for turning tide. In the smoke-filled press room at the Pentagon, American officers stared at the teletype sheets in stunned silence, then erupted. General Omar Bradley, whose 12th Army Group had borne the brunt of the initial German blow, turned white with rage when he read the quotes. His staff later recalling, he crumpled the paper in his fist so hard his knuckles bled. Across the ocean in Versailles, Dwight D. Eisenhower, chain-smoking at his desk in the Trianon Palace Hotel, faced a growing storm as cables poured in from furious subordinates demanding action. The outrage spread quickly to the troops themselves. GIs huddled in snow holes along the shrinking salient picked up the stories, on Armed Forces radio or in dog-eared copies of Stars and Stripes. Their bitterness roared after weeks of fighting in sub-zero cold with frozen rifles and inadequate winter clothing. If Monty's so damn good, one sergeant in the 82nd Airborne reportedly snarled, "Why didn't he stop the bastards on 16 December instead of waiting until we were half dead?" Morale, already strained by the relentless casualties, American losses now approaching 90,000, plummeted further, with some units openly sporting homemade signs reading "No more Monties." In London, Winston Churchill, nursing a whiskey in the map room at 10 Downing Street, felt the first tremors of a crisis that threatened the very foundation of Anglo-American partnership, knowing that if the rift widened, the political cost could be catastrophic, just as the war entered its decisive phase. On 9th January 1945, Eisenhower sat alone in his office at Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, staring at the mounting pile of cables and newspaper clippings. the air thick with cigarette haze and the distant rumble of supply trucks. The crisis had escalated overnight. American generals threatened resignation. Congressmen back home demanded explanations. And even Roosevelt's advisors whispered about the strain on the alliance. Ake, the man who had always prided himself on holding the coalition together, now faced the real possibility that his most celebrated subordinate might force him to choose between national pride and military unity. He drafted a letter to the combined chiefs of staff that morning. A stark ultimatum: either Montgomery must go or he himself would resign, a move that would have detonated the partnership between Britain and America at the precise moment Soviet armies were crossing the Oder. Across the Channel, Churchill acted with characteristic urgency. Summoned from his bed by frantic Foreign Office telegrams, the Prime Minister convened an emergency meeting in the underground. Cabinet war rooms, maps of the Bulge still pinned to the walls from weeks earlier. He understood instantly what was at stake. If Eisenhower quit, the blame would fall on Britain, poisoning post-war relations and weakening London's voice in the coming peace. Puffing furiously on his cigar, Churchill dictated a personal message to Eisenhower, pledging to handle Montgomery himself, while privately seething at the Field Marshal's unhelpful timing. Back in the frozen Ardennes, the fighting continued unabated. American and British troops, shoulder to shoulder, closing the salient, unaware that their commanders' feud now threatened everything they had bled for. As the human cost mounted daily in the snow-choked forests and shattered towns. On 10th of January 1945, Montgomery received a terse summons to London, delivered by a grim-faced aide who handed him the cable from Churchill himself. The Field Marshal, still basking in what he considered a masterful performance at Zonhoven, boarded a Dakota transport at Brussels airfield, the aircraft bucking through low clouds over the Channel, while he reviewed his notes with the calm assurance of a man who had never been wrong. In the underground cabinet war rooms, Churchill waited, flanked by the chiefs of staff, the air heavy with cigar smoke and unspoken fury. When Montgomery entered, the Prime Minister wasted no time, his voice low and cutting. "You have put the alliance in grave danger, Bernard. Your words have inflamed the Americans, and Eisenhower is on the verge of resignation." Montgomery, unaccustomed to rebuke, stiffened, defending his conference as plain truth. The British had indeed stabilized the Northern Front. The Americans had been disorganized, and he had only stated facts. Churchill, eyes narrowing, interrupted sharply, reminding him of the bigger picture. The war was not a personal contest. The Americans were paying the heaviest price in blood and treasure, and one man's ego could not be allowed to jeopardize victory. He ordered Montgomery to issue a public statement, retracting any implication of superiority, to praise Eisenhower and the American commanders explicitly, and to return to the field with humility. The Field Marshal's face flushed, but he nodded, understanding the political reality. Meanwhile, in the Ardennes, the battle raged on, the pocket shrinking daily under relentless Allied pressure, with American artillery pounding German positions and British armor closing from the north, the soldiers oblivious to the high-stakes drama unfolding in smoke-filled rooms far from the snow. On 12th of January 1945, Montgomery returned to his headquarters in the Netherlands, the taste of Churchill's reprimands still bitter. That same evening, under the glare of a single desk lamp, he drafted the statement the Prime Minister had demanded, each sentence weighed against the risk of further humiliation. The final text, released to the press the next morning, began with unequivocal praise. "I have at all times the fullest confidence in General Eisenhower as Supreme Commander," and went on to salute the complete confidence between them, the great victories won by American troops, and the magnificent fighting qualities of the U.S. soldier. He singled out Bradley and Patton by name, crediting their leadership without reservation, words that must have scraped his pride raw. The statement hit the wires on 13 January 1945, and American newspapers ran it prominently, some grudgingly, others with relief. At SHAEF, Eisenhower read it in silence, then quietly tore up the resignation letter he had never sent. Bradley, still seething, accepted the olive branch because the war demanded it. Patton, ever blunt, muttered that Monty had been spanked like a naughty boy. But the crisis began to recede. In the Ardennes, the weather finally cleared. Allied air forces, grounded for weeks, roared overhead in strength, pounding retreating German columns as the salient collapsed. By mid-January, the front was restored. The cost staggering, nearly 100,000 American casualties, thousands of British, and uncounted Belgian civilians caught in the crossfire. Yet the Alliance, bruised but intact, pressed eastward. The episode a stark reminder that victory required not just courage on the battlefield, but restraint in the briefing room. By late January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The German gamble crushed beneath the weight of Allied resolve. The snowfields littered with the charred husks of tigers and the frozen bodies of boys who would never see home. The cost had been apocalyptic: 81,000 American casualties, nearly 20,000 dead. The highest toll of any single battle in US history, alongside 400 British killed and wounded, and thousands of Belgian civilians buried under rubble or executed in reprisal. Yet the victory belonged to no single nation, no solitary commander, but to the stubborn, shared refusal to yield. Montgomery's press conference, that brief, arrogant moment on 7 January 1945, faded from the headlines. As armies raced toward the Rhine, Eisenhower never spoke publicly of the near catastrophe, burying the resignation threat in classified files, while Churchill, in Commons on 18 January 1945, delivered a masterful defense of the alliance, praising American valor in the Ardennes without once naming Montgomery's misstep. The field marshal himself returned to planning Operation Veritable, the push into the Reichswald, his reputation dented but intact among his own troops, who still cheered the beret as it passed in convoy. The episode left scars all the same. American generals grew warier of British proposals. British staff sensed lingering resentment, and soldiers on both sides carried quiet grudges into the final campaigns. The alliance held, forged stronger perhaps by the near break, a reminder that great coalitions are not sustained by brilliance alone, but by the grim necessity of swallowing pride when the alternative is defeat. As spring approached, the road to Berlin lay open, paid for in blood across frozen forests, the brief storm of words in Zonhoven, now just another ghost among the many. In the spring of 1945, as Allied armies surged across the Rhine, the shadow of Zonhoven lingered in quiet conversations and private memos, never fully erased. Montgomery drove forward with Operation Veritable on 8 February 1945, his forces grinding through flooded forests and minefields toward the Rhine, while to the south, American armies under Bradley and Patton executed the broader envelopment that finally broke the Wehrmacht's back. The field marshal's name still drew cheers from British troops, yet across the lines, American soldiers greeted mentions of Monty with skeptical grins or outright scorn. The press conference etched into memory like an old wound. Eisenhower, ever the diplomat, refused to let the episode fester. In meetings at SHAEF, he steered discussions away from recriminations, focusing instead on the final push, knowing that history would judge them not by briefings but by the liberation of camps and the fall of Berlin. Yet even he could not ignore the deeper friction. The British, outnumbered and outproduced, clung to prestige. The Americans, bearing the heaviest burden, grew impatient with anything that smelled of condescension. The alliance survived, but it was never again quite as trusting. As the Reich crumbled, concentration camps were uncovered. Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, the horrors within silencing all petty rivalries. Soldiers who had fought through the Bulge stared at the emaciated survivors and stacked corpses. The true cost of every delayed day laid bare. In that grim light, a single ill-chosen press conference seemed almost trivial, yet it had nearly cost them the unity needed to end the nightmare sooner. The war in Europe raced toward its conclusion, the human toll already beyond reckoning, and the men who had almost broken the coalition in January now shared the same relentless drive toward victory. On 30 April 1945, As Soviet shells hammered central, Berlin and Hitler took his final breath in the Führerbunker. The men who had nearly torn the alliance, apart 4 months earlier, stood on the cusp of total victory. Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, accepted the surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands at Lüneburg Heath on 4 May 1945. His beret tilted defiantly as he watched. General Admiral von Friedeberg signed the instrument of capitulation on a simple, folding table amid the heather. Eisenhower remained in Reims, orchestrating the final act, while Patton's Third Army raced to liberate Czechoslovakia, and Bradley's troops linked up with the Red Army at the Elbe. The press conference of 7 January 1945 was never mentioned in the official histories of the campaign. It lived instead in private letters, post-war memoirs, and the guarded memories of staff, officers who had watched the storm gather and break. Montgomery's own account, published years later, dismissed the episode as a misunderstanding fueled by sensational journalism. American veterans, gathering at reunions in the decades that followed, told darker stories over beer of how close the brass had come to fracturing everything the GIs fought for in the frozen Ardennes. Yet the war's end washed away much of the bitterness. Liberated prisoners stumbled from camps. Displaced millions began the long trek home, and Europe's cities smoldered under spring skies. In that vast reckoning, one arrogant afternoon in a Belgian chateau seemed small, a footnote swallowed by the immense human tide of victory and loss. The final signatures came at Reims on 7 May 1945, and again in Berlin the next day, the guns falling silent at last, the alliance scarred but unbroken. On 8 May 1945, the war in Europe ended, church bells ringing across Britain while crowds surged into London streets, waving flags and weeping in the spring rain. In New York, Times Square exploded in jubilation, sailors kissing strangers under ticker-tape skies. Yet for the men who had fought through the Bulge, victory carried a quieter weight. The empty places at mess tables, the letters never answered. The frozen forests of the Ardennes forever etched in memory. Montgomery's press conference, that near-fatal flare of ego on a January afternoon in Zonhoven, became one of the war's hidden turning points, not on any battlefield, but in the fragile human bonds that held the Allied command together. It exposed the raw edges of national pride, the cost of unchecked ambition, and the razor-thin margin by which the coalition survived its own internal fire. Eisenhower's unspoken willingness to resign, Churchill's midnight intervention, the forced retraction, all vanished into classified folders and private regrets. But they reminded every leader that wars are won as much in restrained words as in daring strokes. In the decades that followed, historians debated strategy and grand decisions, but veterans knew the deeper truth. The alliance endured because, when the moment demanded it, men swallowed pride for the greater cause. The boys who held Bastogne, who closed the salient shoulder to shoulder, British Tommies and American GIs alike, had paid the price in blood. Their commanders, chastened by a single ill-judged hour, ensured that price was not wasted. The guns fell silent, Europe began to heal, and a press conference that almost destroyed the Allied command faded into the long shadow of victory, a cautionary whisper amid the triumph.